Hi everyone, this is Danny, and welcome to Sailing Beautiful. This new channel is dedicated to sharing my story of buying an old sailboat, fixing her up, and chasing a dream. I will be adding new content regularly that covers our adventures along the way. I invite you to subscribe, like the videos, and join me in this adventure. Wait. All this information is great, but I'm hearing that folks want to see more of the fruit of all this labor. Some actual sailing videos? Well, I guess we can make that happen. Here's a quick preview of some of the adventures on the water, which you'll definitely see more of in the future. Then we'll get back into all this info. Cheers! All right, that was awesome. Now we can jump back into all the details of the refit. One of the first items I wanted to tackle in this refit was to restore the teak wood, especially the combing boards and handrails. Cape Dory sailboats are well known for their beautiful teak combing boards that surround their cockpits, and it was important to me to try and save and restore the original teak. I knew this might be difficult, given the fact that the old teak had been cracked in a few places, and it was very weathered. I had originally thought about removing the teak from the boat to work on it, but unfortunately I discovered that the wood had been sealed into place with a product called 3M 5200, which is a very strong adhesive that made it almost impossible to remove the wood without damaging the wood in the process. It was then that I decided to work on the teak while it was still installed on the boat. The first step was to carefully sand the teak, making sure to remove old gray weathering, but not sand too vigorously as to take away too much material or leave grooves or uneven spots. I started with an orbital sander and 100 grit sandpaper. After going over it with the orbital sander, I went back over it with a hand sanding block and 220 grit sandpaper. Once I was satisfied with the sanding work, I carefully cleaned all of the teak with acetone and a rag to remove any remaining dust from sanding. Next, I taped all around the teak with painter's tape to reduce the risk of the teak oil staining the gel coat. And another pointer, if you plan on applying painter's tape to gel coat that is aged and is oxidized, make sure the temperature is not too hot as to have the tape stick too much to the gel coat. After taping it all off, I applied 6 coats of Wacko teak oil over the period of about a week. Wacko Teak oil is a combination of teak oil and varnish that can be found for a very reasonable price in home improvement stores. For each application, I had to ensure the weather was not too humid and there was no rain in the forecast. Each coat had to dry for about 6 to 12 hours, so this became quite a long process. However, in the end, I was very satisfied with the results, and it was very rewarding to see the teak restored. The next project in this refit was to upgrade the electrical system to add some additional circuits for a new automatic bilge pump, a depth transducer, VHF radio, 12-volt USB charger to charge mobile devices, and additional circuits for expansion in the future. The original electrical system was very basic and only included circuits for running lights, interior lights, and the mast and deck light. The ground wires were all spliced together and were tied directly to the negative post on the battery versus a negative bus bar. There was also no battery switch, which is an important safety feature to be able to cut off power to the battery. After taking off the original switch panel, I followed all of the wires to their source to get an idea of how the existing circuits were wired, so I could draw a schematic chart of the existing setup. Then I added in to the chart what I wanted to add to the system and how it would tie into the existing setup. It soon became clear I would need to build an entirely new switch panel to accommodate the changes I wanted to make. I built a simple switch panel box and laid out where I wanted the switches, fuse box, and battery switch to go. I found a 6-port switch panel from Nightlight and a fuse box from Blue Sea with a negative built-in bus bar, as well as a bilge pump switch and a built-in alarm. The 6-port switch panel was originally designed to only have one positive and negative lead going out of the panel, but given the fact that I would be adding multiple circuits to the panel, I modified it to have 3 positive leads so that I could connect each of those leads to their own fuse circuit on the fuse box. I also added a main fuse breaker between the main positive lead and the battery. All wiring I used was marine-grade, tin-coated copper wiring. From the battery to the main switch and fuse box, I used 8-gauge wire. From the main switch to the new bilge pump and backup switch, I used 12-gauge wire, and I used 14-gauge wire to the VHF radio and depth transducer display. I will be covering the design and installation of the new automatic bilge pump, VHF radio, and depth transducer in a later video. To finish the build of the new switch panel box, I cut out the access holes for each component that would be on the box and dry fit each piece before finishing off the box with stain and varnish. Finally, I installed all of the components to the box, then installed the box behind the companionway stairs where there was plenty of room to mount the box and run the wiring to the battery and also to the various electrical components. I also tied in the existing electrical into the new switch panel box, routing the positive lead to the fuse box and the negative lead to the negative bus bar for extra protection. For charging the battery, I purchased a decent 12-volt battery tender that plugs directly into the 30-amp power supply at the docks. Eventually, I'd like to get a solar panel and controller to be able to charge my battery while I'm away from the docks. However, for now, this system works beautifully for this small boat. Another project in this refit was to fix the interior under the forward hatch and then paint the entire interior of the boat. The interior under the hatch looked as though there had been some prior water damage, as the surface was cracked and peeled away, exposing some of the balsa core between the deck and interior fiberglass. Luckily, the balsa core did not seem to be damaged, as there was no water or softness in the core. To fix this issue, I sanded down the surface to clean away all of the damaged material. Then I cleaned the area with acetone and filled in the gaps with thickened epoxy. I had to make several passes with the epoxy, sanding it after each application to ensure I left no air pockets and to create a smooth surface. Next, I cleaned all of the interior surfaces, wiping it down with acetone to make sure the surface was ready for new paint. For paint, I used gloss white Rust-Oleum marine topside paint that is reasonably priced and available at most home improvement stores. This paint is thicker than standard paints, as it is oil-based and made for marine applications. This made it slightly more difficult to apply than other paints, but I was able to get a good coverage using sponge rollers and standard paint brushes for the harder to reach spots. I started with the V-berth and worked my way back throughout the interior of the boat. For this project, I decided to skip using painter's tape and just cut in around the port lights and teak with a tapered painter's brush. This was a lot of work, but after the time I had with the painter's tape adhering too well to the outside surface during the teak restoration, I made the choice to cut in versus tape. I would still recommend using painter's tape if you don't have a steady hand or don't feel like taking the time to cut in around objects with a brush, as this was the longest part of the process. I applied 3 coats throughout the entire boat and ended up using 5 quarts of paint to finish the job. When I was done with this job, the interior of the boat looked almost brand new, and I was very happy with the results. The most daunting task in this refit was the bottom job. When I purchased the boat, I noticed that there were some spots on the hull where there had been some cracking of the gel coat under the anti-foul paint, and some of those cracks even extended up beyond the waterline. There was also some gel coat blistering just above the waterline, as well as some osmotic blistering under the waterline that had not been addressed correctly from the last bottom job. Most of the osmosis blisters were old, dry, and were not actively leaking, but there was one blister spot that was actively leaking a vinegar-smelling fluid, which is a sure sign that the fiberglass resin under the paint and gel coat was degrading, and that would need to be addressed. At this point, the boat had been out of the water for a few months, so I was hopeful that the hull had dried out enough to address this issue. I started by grinding the active osmotic blistering spot with an angle grinder and a 40 grit sanding flap disc. As I got down to the fiberglass layers, it was easy to tell where the damaged fiberglass was, as I continued to grind until I got down to good glass. I could see where the gel coat cracks all led down from the waterline to the spot, so I grinded those cracks out using a Dremel tool and a pointed grinder bit. I followed the cracks from the start all the way down to where they met up at the osmotic blister spot and grinded them all down to glass. As I went along, I seemed to find more cracks than I originally thought, but I kept going until I was confident I found all of the cracks that needed to be addressed. After grinding everything out, I addressed the older blisters around the hull, sanding those down with an orbital sander until I got down to glass. Those older blisters seemed to be hollow, and in some spots I could see where someone had filled them with fairing compound. I decided I would go a bit further in addressing these spots by filling them with thickened epoxy first, before going back over with fairing compound. Once I was satisfied I had uncovered all of the spots that needed to be addressed, it was time to start the fiberglass work. For the osmosis spot, I had grinded out about 6 layers of glass before I got down to good glass. I cut several fiberglass cloth pieces, alternating from biaxial cloth and matte cloth. Then I mixed epoxy resin using West System epoxy. The materials I used were West System 105 resin, 206 slow hardener to allow enough time to work the resin before it cured in the hot Florida weather, and 406 colloidal silica for thickening the resin. I mixed up the resin and added the silica to thicken the resin to apply to the osmosis spot. Then I mixed up some clean resin and hardener to apply to the fiberglass cloth. I placed the fiberglass in place to fill in the spot, alternating between the biaxial cloth and matte fiberglass to ensure structural integrity. The larger pieces were last as the diameter of the spot increased. Each time I added cloth, I made sure to work the cloth in place and remove any air pockets. I made sure when the job was done, the spot was slightly raised over the rest of the hull shape so that I would have plenty of room to sand it all down smooth when it was cured. To address the cracks in other spots in the hull that I had sanded down, I mixed another batch of thickened epoxy and filled them with this epoxy mixture, using a plastic smoothing tool to make sure the spots were all completely filled in. Then I let everything cure for at least 12 hours. I had to go back and sand and reapply some spots until I was satisfied all of the spots were completely filled. Once everything was cured, I used an orbital sander to sand everything smooth and flat. Then I used 410 fairing filler to mix with the 105 resin to make a fairing compound and went over everything again with the fairing compound. 12 hours later, the fairing compound was cured and I sanded everything again until I was satisfied it was all smooth and ready for barrier coat primer paint. For barrier coat primer paint, I used 2-part Interlux Interprotect 2000E, which was quite expensive but had great reviews. I mixed the paint according to the instructions and covered all of the spots I had worked on with 2 coats of primer, making sure I followed instructions on timing how long I needed to wait before applying the second coat without having to sand again. Once the primer was dry, it was time to cover those spots with anti-foul paint. For anti-foul paint, I used Blue Water Copper Shield 25, which included a copper additive that is helpful in preventing growth on the bottom. I applied 2 coats of anti-foul paint to the spots I had addressed, again following the instructions on application. At this point, I was 3 months into the refit and I was very anxious to get the boat in the water. I had originally decided to just address the spots that needed attention, but when I looked at the bottom, I decided I wanted to go ahead and do the whole bottom. This would be more work and would take more time, but doing the whole bottom would avoid me having to pull the boat again next season to finish the job. I sanded the rest of the hull around the areas that I had already done using my orbital sander, which took another weekend worth of work. Then I covered those spots with barrier coat primer and finally anti-foul paint. The only spots I was not able to address were the spots under the bunks on the trailer, as I did not have a way to lift the boat off the trailer. Therefore, I'll address those spots on my next haul out. Some of the cracks and gel coat blisters were above the waterline, but were in the area of the boot stripe paint. I addressed these spots in the same manner as the spots below the waterline, but instead of using anti-foul paint, I used Rust-Oleum topside paint to cover the area above the boot stripe. For the boot stripe, I taped off the waterline and top of the boot stripe. Unfortunately, I made a mistake here when I used a standard exterior paint that matched the color of the original boot stripe. However, this paint was not oil-based, so since it's been in the water, some of this paint is flaked off. I will need to address this on my next haul out. Despite this mistake, the paint still looks pretty good, and I have been completely satisfied with the results of the bottom paint. On last inspection by a diver who cleaned the bottom for me, the anti-foul paint still looks fine and there are no issues. After this part of the refit, it was finally time to wrap up work on the last few projects and then get this boat in the water. I will cover this part of the project in the next episode, so stay tuned. Okay, that was a little summary of the larger projects in the refit. There were some other smaller projects like installing an auto bilge pump, a new through hull, and a VHF radio and antenna. Those projects will be covered in the next episode, so please stick around for that. Thank you all so much for watching, and if you'd like the video, please click on that like button, and please subscribe if you'd like to see more. Until next time, cheers!